Thank you, everyone, for joining our review and study of the second part of 2026 astrological cycles. I appreciate everyone's contribution and donations. And if you watch this video anytime in the following weeks, consider making a donation on my website. And this money is used for scholarships, for education. So we hope that it's going to serve a greater purpose, and it's a great way to give back. 2026, we've already covered the first half. Time is flying. And we've seen in our first presentation how most of the things we talked about really came to be. And that's the purpose of astrology, is to be informed and to understand time. In a nutshell, astrology is a study of time. So we understand that every minute, as the ascendant shifts, as planets like hands of a clock are rotating, there is a different meaning, there is a different intention. And the purpose of studying ahead of time is not just to make predictions and to brag about how astrology is accurate, but it's to be better prepared and hopefully to prevent worst case scenarios. When I'm going to talk today about the different alignments, some of it will sound very scary. Some of it, will be room for opportunity. So when we speak about these potentials and we speak about these risks, our purpose, our intention is that the more aligned we are, the better we understand what the intention is, the more graceful we can navigate these currents. And in my experience, it works. It doesn't mean that if you're a good astrologer, you don't, experience crisis. There is an element of fate, there is an element of karmic unfolding, but there's also an element of consciousness because if you need to learn a lesson and you're learning it, you don't need as much wake-up calls or triggers. Um, and that's helpful. So as we speak today about those different aspects and alignments, we're going to obviously explore the geopolitical climate, explore transits for countries and public figures, and how that affects us as individuals. So when we understand what the whole world is going through, we also can learn more about ourselves. We went through initially the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in February, the big eclipses of February that led to the conflict with Iran, the naval attacks and difficulties. And one of the things that was very critical and mentioned in the previous video was that the month of March and April was going to be extremely challenging for Trump. And the reason is um, that Trump Neptune is at 5 degrees Libra, and Saturn was opposing it. When there is a Saturn-Neptune opposition, it is the hardest aspect for political figures. Every, range of politics, Saturn-Neptune is deeply humbling. It takes you down your pedestal. It takes control. away from the leader. And so if the leader is in any way not in integrity, it's going to be a slap in the face. It's going to be a rug pulled from under. And that is basically what happened with the Iran war not meeting any of the objectives that it was trying to establish. But beyond that, a lot of personal difficulties were expected for him. So when we understand what's going on, why we focus so much on Trump, because everything he says and does affect all of us. His leadership is a global impact. And understanding what's happening in his chart informs us. So we're going to continue touching on that, but see also how we can better work through that. What are the milestones for the coming few months? We're talking about July to December, and even we're going to glance at 2027 because, planets don't stop on December 31st. Chiron just moved into Taurus for 3 months. It's going to stay on the 0 degree, 1 degree pretty much, and then retrograde back to Aries, then move fully into Taurus next April 27. Now, Chiron, my friends, is one tiny, mighty, incredible body in the sky that we need to track and trace and understand because it is so deep and also so strong that if you're not paying attention to Chiron, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle. So looking at Chiron in Taurus is going to inform us a lot about what's going on. I have already presented 1 or 2 videos on Chiron in Taurus. You can reflect back on them. They are on the YouTube channel. Um, but today I'm going to particularly speak about the Chiron-Jupiter connection because as Chiron moved into Taurus, Jupiter moved into Leo, and they are locked into a square. Then Jupiter moves forward a little faster, and Jupiter is going to align with the opposition to Pluto. So we are having this early degrees of fixed signs with Jupiter, Pluto, Chiron. And, just to quickly, those of you who follow my page, Evolutionary Skies, we already explore some of the themes about that, but it's good to bring them back here on record. So one of the expression was a division within the Catholic Church. Now, who cares what the Pope is doing? Some Catholic may care, but for us astrologers is to understand how these energies work. So there's a group of radical conservative Catholics who are opposed to any kind of change and reforms and modernization of the church. And this is a movement that started in the early 70s. It peaked in 1988, and they ordained all kinds of bishops and reverends, and I don't know exactly the terms, even though the Pope did not approve. So they're kind of renegade. And it's interesting that this happens also with the Uranus Mars square, which is rebellious. And it teaches us that rebellion is not just about making change forward. Sometimes rebellion is about going back in time. And we see that over and over again. The same thing with Trump being a Sun Uranus, he's a change maker, but he wants to bring back traditional values, family values, whatnot. And so we need to understand that about Uranus is that wanting to challenge the status quo, it's not necessarily about progress and modernity. It can also be about bringing, backpedaling. Anyway, going back to this chart, why do I pay attention to what's going on in the Vatican? Because Jupiter has to do with religion. And wherever Jupiter goes, now in Leo, in the Pope Leo, it will affect our belief systems. So what's happening in the Vatican, that schism, is happening to all of us when we have to make decisions about how we want to lead our lives, what's important for us, what's acceptable and what isn't. So this Jupiter square Chiron happens to lock on Pope 0 degree Chiron in Aquarius. And what happens is exactly that. Aquarius has to do with his community, has to do with the group of Catholics. And the Chiron Jupiter opposition with Uranus as well shows a rift in the community because of ideological Jupiter, ideological differences, disagreement. And so this is very important for us to understand as a function of that. We're going to probably come back to this chart as well. But this is part of this Chiron Jupiter square. We are facing some kind of bubble burst. Now, Jupiter is going to oppose Leo, and later in November, Jupiter is going to conjunct Mars and the South Node at 25 Leo. And I've told, so those of you who follow my work, I have reiterated time and time again that Jupiter Mars aspect are very, very, let's use the word fierce. They're kind of an unstoppable energy, deep, deep willpower that can be used for positive purposes and destructive purposes. It's the bulldozer. Okay, it just ravages, break through old growth, new growth. It just carves its way. It's mighty. It's a mighty force, and sometimes a mighty monster. In July, end of this month, we're going to also experience this great grand sextile, which has now received all kinds of nicknames, the Barbeau basket, the grand sextile, etc. And what's very particular for July is that while Jupiter, Pluto, and Uranus align all at 4 degrees, Jupiter is joining them. And so that kind of adds another outer planet to the mix. But this grand sextile between Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto is actually locking together until 2028. So it's not just happening now. It's a long process. But the 4 degree is going to be highlighted now. Not mentioned here, but we're going to obviously touch on that. We have the nodes moving to, let me actually just write it now. The nodes are moving to Leo and Aquarius. And so That is a major shift that also applies to eclipses. So the nodes are going to be in Leo Aquarius from the end of July 2026 until January 2028. They stay on an axis for a period of 18 months. So when we look back, just a note as we complete the Virgo Pisces axis, wherever the nodes travel, they bring very deep developmental questions, changes, and activations, not just through the eclipse, but just by the fact that they travel through these signs. And so one of the main effects that happened in Virgo Pisces was employment. A lot of questions about jobs. Are people keeping their jobs? Companies laying off, hundreds and thousands of people. And in this context, also the threat of AI that is replacing people's jobs and leaders, influence, people in position of influence talking about what are the new models of work. Many different suggestions, some of them quite scary, some of them trying to rebalance things. But I just want to highlight how the question about labor, about availability of people to perform the work, whether it's those who were working in the fields in the United States, many of the immigrants and illegal immigrants that were deported and left, a vacuum of basically not having labor force, to government slashing jobs through Doge last year, through the AI development, all that affected the Virgo Pisces equation. Now we're moving into Leo Aquarius, and we already noticed Jupiter's in Leo, nodes are in Leo Aquarius, the grand sextile is all in fire, air. So there's an abundance of Leo Aquarius energies with Jupiter, Pluto, and the nodes, along with all these Aries, Gemini energies. So when we have all these extroverted signs, it brings a lot of creativity, but it also brings a lot of excess and risk. It is prone for risk and excess and development, but also going overboard, abuse, and the right use of power. So it's going to be interesting as the nodes move into Leo Aquarius. This is an axis that is actually very intimately linked to ancient civilization of Atlantis. Whether that is a myth or a reality, we see it happening because the Aquarius Leo axis is an axis that represents leadership. It opposes Aquarius is the human, Leo is the lion. These are the two leaders of the food chain. They are on top of the food chain pyramid. And so it's not a coincidence that they are zodiacally positioned on an axis together. And they represent our agency and our need to make this world a better place. So let's see what happens. Soon after the node move, we have the eclipses, two eclipses, one at 20 degrees Leo in August, and the other one at 4 degrees Pisces Virgo. So that's going to be the last eclipse in Virgo Pisces before they all apply to the Leo Aquarius axis. Soon after, we're going to look at very interesting Venus cycle activations already beginning in July. July is a very, very active month. So the first square between Venus and Mars at 21 degrees Gemini Virgo. And because Venus is going retrograde, excuse me, it's going to form another square to Mars, this time in Scorpio Leo. So we have two Venus-Mars squares, and Venus-Mars are related to relationships, who gets along with whom, personal relationships, um, political relationships. But another aspect of Venus-Mars is financial security. So when they are in aspect to one another, there are usually changes in the interest rate, in the value markets, and that affects our livelihood and our investments for better and worse. And so we're starting with Jupiter in Leo. It's going to stay there about 13 months. It's in its slow phase of its cycle. And, when you think about Jupiter in Leo, it's represents great abundance. It represents something glorious. It has this radiance because Jupiter amplifies and Leo has to do with the solar power, the source of life. And so there's something that can be quite extraordinary about this phase of Jupiter's cycle. Um, and definitely is about showing up. It is about taking our life to the next level. But how do we go about that is the big question. Now, think about this interplay between the grandeur, the nobility, the leadership, the higher calling that Jupiter in Leo brings, and the economic wealth management of Chiron in Taurus. So we looked at the Pope and we saw how, there was a rift, an ideological rift in the church. But there's also something about Jupiter Chiron in these fixed signs that represents great questions about great wealth. Taurus and Leo are the signs of resources, of material grandeur. So when you have these strong alignments, particularly Jupiter, that is an amplifier, in the sign of Leo, square Taurus, remember that Chiron can bring crisis, humbling experiences, but Chiron is also the maverick. Chiron is often an energy that's unhinged. And it often comes in surprising ways because in the myth, Chiron was this weird hybrid. Nobody knew, his mother rejected him, and yet he proved everyone wrong. by becoming the master. And wherever you have Chiron, you have genius. You have something that is unique, that is different, and that can be extraordinary. So the extraordinary quality of Chiron in the sign of Taurus can bring extraordinary insight into economic, physical, material management, and it can also bring unhinged behaviors. It's not a coincidence that Elon Musk was proclaimed a trillionaire just as Chiron enters into Taurus. It's something that is off the charts. The gap between Elon Musk and the next one in line, as far as amounts of wealth, is like 5 times the amount of money. And now, in a very Chironic Jupiter way, there's this kind of inflation and then bubble burst. So when we look at Jupiter in Leo, the the creativity is enormous, but so is the megalomania. And the square to Chiron can both take this energy to something genius, to something extreme, and it can also poof, deflate in a matter of, quickly. So let's look at some of these themes. So when you look at both of them, there is this element of, like we say, opulence, the financial elite, the gluttony, the economic gaps. So some people are going to become extremely wealthy. Nothing new, but the scale keeps increasing. And as it is with every cycle, you have the expansion and then you have the contraction. Chiron was in Taurus from 1976 until the early 80s. So about 7 years, 83-ish. And so it will be now from 2026 until 2034. Now Jupiter moves much faster, so we're going to look at how important that is. But when I spoke about the Venus cycle coming and Venus going retrograde and square Mars, keep in mind that Venus rules Taurus. So as Chiron moves into Taurus, the cycle of Venus becomes more pronounced, even more important, because they communicate with each other. So, this is part of what's happening just as this aspect is forming. We see reports, we all knew this, but we see now confirmed reports that Trump, during his 1 year and a half of presidency, made $2 billion. Unprecedented for a president. Part of it is bribery. People pay him so that they won't go to jail and so they will get business opportunities. Part of it is his lawsuit that he has sued, everyone who attacked him in the 2020s. Whatever, whether it was business or it was manipulation and bribes, there is this extraordinary amount of money circulating at the top echelon. And again, this comes right as this Jupiter in Leo squares Chiron, and even his base is not so happy with that because it, many of them voted because they wanted a businessman in charge. But what happens when the wealth is not redistributed, as we see with Elon Musk becoming again, right as this is happening, he's proclaimed the first trillionaire. And this is the same person who says that empathy is a weakness. And this is the same person that cuts aid for the most vulnerable populations on Earth. And right now, as this Chiron squared Jupiter is happening, questions about how he deregulated and gutted Ebola uh, prevention clinic and how he gutted AIDS program and food programs. All this was silent. I mean, we all knew it. I talked about it over and over again, but it wasn't discussed on a public level until now that he was proclaimed trillionaire, and this Jupiter Chiron shows this extreme wealth contrasted, by people living in substandards and the wealth not accessing anyone but a few. So, it's classic material for disenchantment and for revolution and for people being basically disillusioned. So there's a bubble burst. Speaking about Ebola, another chart that I posted on Evolutionary Skies and on Facebook. This is the inception chart when the virus was first named, identified in 1976, just as Chiron got into Taurus. So there's a Chiron return for Ebola. Natally, that happened on a new moon, square Pluto. And one of the most deadly outbreaks, we want to test how reliable these charts are. So we see how things are sequencing. And one of the greatest outbreak that occurred in 2013 happened when uh, Hygeia was on Chiron, on the natal Chiron. So somebody is saying that they can't see the chart. Um, Everyone can. So yeah, it's a personal issue. You may have to look at your Zoom. So what I'm basically saying is that it would be interesting to track this as there's a new outbreak because of the deregulation. And we have a Chiron return happening in 2027. It's going to be exact, but it's already very, very close. So why are we bringing this up? Not only because it can be a public threat, but because we see how this Chiron Jupiter is playing out. We see the religious side of it and we see the economic side of it. Now, remember, wherever Jupiter goes, it brings ideology. So when you have just Leo, maybe you want to have kids. Maybe you want to be an artist. Maybe you're going to start your own business. It's creative energy. It speaks about what you do with your life, your sun, your solar power. But when Jupiter comes into Leo, you start to have belief systems attached to those themes. So you start to have belief systems associated with fertility in children, belief systems about who is a leader, what is a leader about. So people are going to develop theories. They're going to have a religion, Jupiter, associated with that sign. So another thing we're seeing with Jupiter in Leo is big debates and ideologies about what is going on with um, growth rates, birth rates in the world. This is a big, big debate that is happening very practically, where many Western countries and some Eastern, from Japan to China, are seeing a major decline in birth rates, and that creates a gap between the working force and the retiring force, and it threatens the economy, Chiron and Taurus. So there are now many ideologies around what's the best way to move forward. And you'll have two camps, two Jupiterian camps. One is going to say, have babies. The other one is going to say, we are overpopulated. We need to rebalance growth rates. This taps into, filters down to many, many different ideologies because those who want to increase birth rates for any reason, whether it's economic reason, whether it's ideological, religious reasons, are seeing women as a key problem or key agent. Because if you want birth rates to increase, it's all about women. They are the ones who do that. So you have a camp now of religious extremists who are basically pushing for women to stop working so they can have babies. How chironic is that? You know, Erica Kirk, who kind of is the spokesperson for the Christian right, is talking about encouraging women to dump their career, to not have to seek education so that they can devote themselves to having children. So you have a mix of religion, Jupiter, mixed with economic questions. And look how it's phrased that many people today are afraid of bringing children to the world because many people are struggling financially. It's one thing to have sex, it's another thing to raise a kid for 20, 25 years. So the economic dimension and equation with children, is inseparable. And in today's world where everything is so volatile, the sense of security is not there to encourage birth growth. And yet, on the male side of things, there's a new now term. How Jupiter in Leo is that kid maxing. You have look maxing, where people hammer their heads to create bone growth. Another Chiron in Taurus, Chiron in Aries, Chiron in Taurus anomaly. And now we have kid maxing. And again, Jupiter in Leo has to do with fertility and increasing yourself. So definitely has to do with genetic reproduction. Now, in some traditional schools, Leo is considered a barren sign. Not here. I've never seen Leo being a barren sign. It's one of the most fertile sign I've ever seen. And I give a lot of readings when helping couples get pregnant, and it works. So, just for the record, if you want to know where I'm coming from. So, kid maxing for millionaires or billionaires. Some very rich Chinese men have sought the assistance of American surrogacy because surrogacy is legal in the United States to sire staggering number of children. The founder, one of these men, expressed a desire to have more than 200 children at once. So you understand the Jupiterian megalomaniac and the Jupiter ideology, that this is not because a person wants to be a father in a traditional Leonian way. It's a person who's building an army and will probably never see these children. And he probably will never care for them. But he wants his genes to be uh, reproduced. Musk is reported to have told the mother that he wants to reach a legion level. He wants smart people and rich people to have children. Not everyone. So we're leaning here into selective breeding. It's not just encourage people to have more kids, but it's those who have the dollar gene and those who have the Marilyn Monroe pretty gene and those who are basically have academic genes. So what about those who are the average people? What's going to happen to their Jupiter in Leo? Are we going to, from an ideological point of view, justify, because wherever you have Jupiter, you have a theory and you have a justification. Does that lead to the justification that some people should not have children and those who are good contenders should have 200 children? So Jupiter starts to bring all kinds of justification, explanation, reasonings that are totally personal and subjective, but they catch like wildfire. Eugenics is an Aquarian issue. So when we have Jupiter in Leo opposing Pluto in Aquarius, this is where the ideology is now engineered through Aquarian science and repopulation slash depopulation agendas. So when we're looking ahead and we see that Jupiter will be opposing Pluto, you can anticipate this is what's going to happen end of July. Jupiter at 4 Leo is going to oppose Pluto at 4 Aquarius. Are we going to have um, this kind of dynamic between population growth, new policies to promote that, but then science, dark agendas to pick and choose the genes that you want? And this is already happening on some other level. Now, I also want to highlight a positive scenario here where there could be breakthroughs in science to help people with fertility. So this can be creative in a supportive way, but there's also the risk of a dark agenda. So going back to the eugenics, one egg donor participating in this person's baby project told her he wants 12 blonde hair, blue-eyed boys. Does that sound familiar? Epstein's email revealed a similar obsession with blue eyes. The information reported that Musk has used polygenic embryo screening, which can cost thousands of dollars to enable parents to choose embryos based on desired genetic profiles. And we know that one of the genetic profile that he's looking for is not going to include empathy. That's not what he's screening for. So, this Leo Aquarius, if I spoke about Atlantis, Atlantis was all about the right use of science, the right use of intelligence, and the grandeur, the potential grandeur of the human spirit. So it can be extraordinary and it can turn into um, serious abuse. So kid maxing, just to, this is from this article, okay? There's an article in the New York Times. You'll have the slides, for those of you who contributed, and you'll be able to read the whole thing. So, like we said, apparently this whole uh, reproduction scheme has little thought about the well-being of the infants who are going to be born. Mr. Shu, a man whose ex-partner accused him of having 300 children, spoke with an American court. Uh, he has not even bothered to meet several of his children. They were being raised by nannies in Irvine, California, while they waited for the document to travel to China. He explained to the judge, who was evaluating a number of surrogacy petition in his name, that work had been busy, so he doesn't have time to check on the kids because he's got projects. Now, it's interesting to look back at history. I try to see, when exactly that happened, but there was a law that happened in the early 1800s, right as the United States, was in its infancy, where there was a law prohibiting to bring more slaves to the United States. Suddenly they had a moral indignation and didn't want to, thought that it wasn't appropriate to bring more slaves, but there was no law to have slaves. It was just like you couldn't bring new ones. So how are we going to solve the problem? We are going to create and manufacture slaves. Natural increase, historians call it forced reproduction. So the slaves were forced to reproduce, and many of them were raped, so that from 700,000 slaves, it ballooned to 4 million through this policy of reproduction, of forcing women slave not only to work in the fields, but to breed babies. And so you transpose that to modern time, and you have the 2026 version of women, not voting, not going to work, and women not being able to have abortions. So we're not caring about the well-being of the kids or the mother. We're caring about workforce. Number one, free labor. Number two, good genes. So now it takes kind of a modern twist to that. But we go back to the Virgo Pisces nodal axis, labor force. The whole worry about not having, you know, birth rates going up is linked to the fact that there's not enough labor force. Now, many of the European countries and the United States are enforcing very strong immigration restrictions. So most, back in earlier days, the reason Germany and France and England encourage immigration is because they needed workers, because their own population was not reproducing at the same rate. So they needed to increase the labor force. But now, because of the perceived threats of immigrants coming from other cultures and not being the pedigree good genes that they're looking for, the method is to shut the borders and force white women who have the genetic pedigree to reproduce. And so you start to understand what's behind Erica's Kirk messages here, whether she's consciously aware of that or whether, it's done through her. This is happening, is that you need the workforce, you need an army, but you don't want them to be brown people. You want them to come from wealthy, white, whatever. And who's going to do that? We're going to, just like back in the day, they forced slave women to reproduce. Now they're enslaving the white women. So this Jupiter in Leo with the nodal axis in Leo Aquarius is very likely going to bring these debates, these questions, these methods, these ideologies about how are we facing the next growth um, crisis of population. Now, this is an interesting case. I brought it up in my webinar on Jupiter. It was a really good session. So this is a philosopher from South Africa. His name is David Benatar. And his message is anti-natalism. I mean, you can Google him. It's kind of interesting to see how they phrase things. But one of the quotes that I found to kind of capture this, it says, it's curious that while good people go to great length to spare their children from suffering, few of them seem to notice that the one and only guaranteed way to prevent suffering from their children is to not bring them into existence. So for these anti-natalism folks, the Earth is hell for several reasons. There's too much suffering here, but also because we're overpopulated and bringing more children is exacerbating resources. Chiron in Taurus, do we have enough to feed everyone? Do we have enough food and land and resources? And so you have a growing movement who wants to block birth rates. And lo and behold, it's the same Jupiter in Leo at 4 degrees where it's going to repeat now. So Mr. Benatar is having his fifth Jupiter return and had his second Saturn return recently. I mean, not only is he a Jupiter in Leo, the Sun is in Sag, which normally would be all about more and increase. But because that Sun squares Saturn and Chiron, and it takes the Jupiter in a retrograde fashion to instead of increase, the ideology Jupiter about children, Leo, is decrease. It's the bursting the balloon. He's not alone. He is going to be we can track whether something's going to happen in July when he has his return, but you're going to hear more voices that are going to say, similar things. Now, another interesting example from history. I know I was looking at who has Jupiter in Leo square Chiron in Taurus and came upon Mr. Osho Rajneesh. So we talk about excesses and nobility and the extreme socioeconomic gaps. And think about him being a teacher, again, a Sagittarius, a spiritual teacher. Jupiter in Leo, who collects Rolls Royces and has a fleet of 93 cars that he probably never drove. While he's teaching, people about liberation and sexual liberation and, look at his moon Saturn and how repressed he is emotionally and how he used his own wound of repression and oppression to make money. Eighth house, second house. So we won't go fully into, the intricacies of his chart, but just to look at that Jupiter extravagance and wealth, with Chiron in the 12th house, you see here this combination of materialism and spirituality. How to materialize spirituality. Now, on a higher purpose, on a higher frequency, we need to marry spirituality with materialism. The same way we need to honor our bodies, honor the earth as a spiritual practice. Money is sacred until you abuse it, until spirituality is used in a deceiving way for material gain. So Some people will say, if you practice spiritual, if you're a spiritual person, you shouldn't be charging, you should live in the vows of poverty. But that leads to another form of abuse. And here is the other extreme of 12th house spirituality with Taurus materialism, Chiron, extraordinary genius, maverick personality, square Jupiter in the third house, knowing what and when and how to say things. Now, in a positive way, because there is a positive way, we can see the Jupiter in Leo fighting extinction because Leo represents all forms of life. It's about caring for children in an empathic way, not in an industrious way, not in an enslaving way, not in a industrial way, but in a loving way. Leo at its core has to do with heart-centeredness, with caring for life and living. So all of us here are on board with that, I trust. So Jupiter in Leo can bring more awareness about species being extinct and what to do to change that. And if we look at, and at the grand sextile chart, and we see the concern for the birth rates of animals, the destruction of ecosystems, we can see how Uranus in Gemini, Pluto in Aquarius can bring new technology, new knowledge to improve the odds. We already have seen attempts to use stem cells in order to recreate through labs and cloning to recreate species that went extinct. They were partially successful, but I suspect that we'll hear more about bringing back the mammoth and bringing back the Tasmanian tiger or any kind of species that was extinct, bring them back from the dead. Pluto in Aquarius, genetic interference to bring species back from the dead. Now, people will argue, is that a good thing or not? Is the ecosystem able to now adapt to these changes? Jupiter likes to argue, so we're going to have debates. Okay. Um, Similarly, it's interesting that the previous Jupiter cycle was a discovery of the first exoplanet. Now, what are exoplanet? They are planets that have the same kind of constitution and status as the Earth. So these are planets where there's potential for life. And they have to be, usually they're orbiting another sun. So they're pretty much like another duplicate uh, solar system. So discovering exoplanets means that we may find uh, proof of life in space. So that's another form of this Jupiter in Aquarius. Excuse me, in Leo. It it really matches this Aquarian and Uranus in Gemini alignment of some kind of breakthrough that could happen even as soon as these coming weeks. That's when, they all come together. But even if it's not this coming week, it may come in the coming year. So if we, since then, many exoplanets were discovered without clear indication whether they supported life. Some had water, some didn't, so it's kind of in its toddler stage of exploration. But I suspect, again, that Jupiter in Leo is going to bring attention to life, to uh, how to support life, how to discover life, how to take care of life, whether it's through exploitation or whether it's through uh, authentic, empathic care. Now, another thing I want to bring to your attention, in astrology, we use the geodetic grid. So what is the geodetic grid? It's a division of the map of the Earth into 12 equal parts, the red lines, starting with Greenwich, England. And then you go east 30 degrees for each future sign. What does that mean? Is that in this geodetic grid, wherever the red line is, the MC is going to be 0 of that sign. And as you move east, it increases 1 Aries, 2 Aries, 3 Aries until you reach 29 Aries and then 0 Taurus. Now, the ascendant lines are the yellow lines. So, Leo rising is between Sudan and Kenya here and Southern Europe to the east until 0 Virgo, which is past the Middle East. In other words, this division of map brings Taurus and Leo in the Middle East. And it may sound bizarre because it's an arbitrary division. There's nothing really happening at Greenwich. It's a human invention to have these longitudinal lines numbered according to Greenwich. But we always have to remember as astrologers and as seekers that nothing is by accident. And if something sticks and that the division of longitude is sticking with the 0 Greenwich, we need to pay attention to it. So as far as our civilization is concerned, as far as the way the world is now divided in countries and in latitudes, this is our model. And we are now using the geodetic grid to astrologize geographically. Now, when you look at the different coordinates for the different countries in this range, you have Tehran at 28 Leo rising and 23 Taurus MC. And that is fixed. So this means that the ascendant and an MC is always going to be the same in these areas of the world. So when there's a transit at 28 Leo or 23 Taurus, it's going to impact Iran, Tehran specifically, more prominently. And so it is with Saudi Arabia, and so it is with Israel, and so it is with Ukraine and Moscow. So they're all in this Leo Taurus range, which is now being activated by Jupiter Chiron. How does this work? Let's look at it. Um, where's that chart? I think it's this one. No, just a moment. I'm going to show you something interesting. So here it is. This is the recent attack on Iran on February 28, 2026 in the morning. So you have the geodetic coordinate for Tehran, which is 28 Leo rising and 23 Taurus MC. And this happened to be the chart of Israel because Israel's Mars is 28 Leo and Israel's Sun is 23 Taurus. So is that a coincidence that Iran and Israel are at each other's throat? That Iran is obsessed with Israel and has funded Hamas and Hezbollah and all these guerrilla forces to neutralize Israel. And Israel is obsessed with trying to um, weaken Iran and weaken the atomic programs. Now, the war started with Mars at 28 Aquarius, which was the eclipse degree of February 17, right? We all know that. But it lands on the geodetic coordinates of Iran. So what I'm saying is when you look at these and you see the progression of Jupiter moving through Leo, and later on the progression of Chiron, because Chiron is still much slower, pay attention to what happens in the Middle East. I mean, there's always something happening there, but I'm going to show you another chart that is kind of capturing um, this Middle East related to Leo and Taurus. And you wonder, right? On the one hand, many of the Middle Eastern countries are resource rich. So many of them have oil. And then that's the Taurus part. And then many of them are fighting over territory, Taurus. So Israel and Palestine, trying to divide these very, very minuscule piece of land into two extremely divided and different uh, cultures. It's all Taurus stuff. Land, who has the land? And it's all measured by tiny square footage because the land is so small. So this is the chart that is critical in anyone who studies the Middle East. It's it's called the Middle East Partition. This is when European nations met in Italy to discuss the future of the Middle East following the fall of the Ottoman Empire. You had the British and the French, and don't remember who else. And they said, this country is going to look like that. It's going to be Syria, and this country is going to be Palestine, and this country is going to be Jordan. And so they kind of drew boundaries artificially, the same way they did in Africa. But look at this chart. Moon in Leo, Sun in Taurus, nodes in Taurus, Jupiter, Neptune in Leo. And if you track this chart and transits to this chart, you will have many cues for the way the dynamics are activated. And there's something, very interesting here is that Mars is retrograde opposing the Sun. So no wonder it's constantly charged and, you know, conflict, a lot of conflict. So the Sun squares the Moon, squares Mars. That's why you ask yourself sometimes, could astrologers make this world a better place by not deciding the fate of countries when the Sun opposes Mars? But pay attention to when, 4 degrees, we talked about Pluto being for Aquarius, Jupiter being for Leo, and then Jupiter returned to this chart. And lo and behold, look at these nodes, Taurus, Scorpio, and look at the Sun in Taurus and the Moon in Leo. Right? You'll recognize this quickly. This is the chart of the state of Israel. Sun in Taurus, Moon in Leo, nodes opposite the San Remo, Italy chart in Taurus, Scorpio. So you see this repetition of Leo, Taurus throughout the charts of the Middle East. So whether it comes from the geodetic grid or else, um, it's worth, looking into these mundane astrology dynamics. Now, let's look back at some of the history of Jupiter in Leo. Talk about Iran. The Shah left Iran with Jupiter exactly on the IC at 5 degrees, square Chiron in Taurus. Wow. So when we look at these cycles, we can better be we can better understand what's coming up. This Jupiter is basically showing that he is in exile. He's becoming an exile leader, and soon after, he's going to die of cancer. Mars is opposing, which is exacerbating, the exile, the rupture, the danger. We had a Mars Sun conjunction in Capricorn earlier this year. Jupiter was not yet in Leo. But when Jupiter is going to return to these degrees, and it's going to be in opposition to Pluto, and then Mars coming into Leo in October, is there going to be a change of leadership? Not just in Iran, but other places. Mr. Zelensky is an Aquarius Leo Chiron in Taurus born. So he's about to have his Pluto on his sun already. Jupiter is just moving on his Mars, and you see how Ukraine and Russia are now in some kind of escalation. And he's about to have a Chiron return in Taurus. It's already pretty close. And Chiron in Taurus, territory. Is there going to be gain or loss or both? With Jupiter in Leo is in favor for him because he's a moon in Leo and he's a Saturn in Leo. And so moon Saturn brings sovereignty. So Jupiter moving on his moon Saturn is promising for Zelensky. However, Pluto on his sun opposing Jupiter this coming July can also mean that there's going to be a change of leadership in Ukraine. Whether it's under him or whether it's him starting to bring successors, pay attention to what's happening as Jupiter hits 5 Leo. And, I showed earlier the chart of Israel. Israel is ahead of elections. The latest that these elections could take place is October 27, but they could happen before that. So if we look back at the chart of Israel, with the transits of Jupiter-Pluto opposition right on the moon, I suspect that this is going to be decisive for the date of the elections. And they could be happening before October. It looks like it. So anyone with 4 degrees of any sign is activated, but particularly the fixed signs. So Neptune is 4, Uranus is 4, Jupiter is 4, Pluto is 4, right? And they're all lining up with the moon, which has to do with the identity and 10th house leadership. So the likelihood of a shift here is critical. Unfortunately, for those of us who are concerned about human rights and who are concerned about democracy and concerned about peace, the two candidates are hardliner right-wing extremists. So while the country is not, a two-party system like the US, it is multiple parties. And so it can be sometimes better balanced. The two leading figures in the polls are not friendly. So you wonder, you know, whether these elections are going to change anything. Another front, Greenland. Greenland had a home rule referendum in 1979 that gave them some autonomy. Excuse me, that's the smoke of the wildfires. And so they gain more autonomy from Denmark, which was the colonial entity. And what do you notice? That both Denmark and Greenland are Jupiter in Leo countries. One retrograde, one direct. And yes, square Chiron in Taurus. So yes, Greenland is not done. Trump is not done with Greenland. That's my anticipation. We may see this summer and November. I'm going to explain why November is critical. We may see new measures, new steps around the tension with Greenland. And this is so, so critical because it involves NATO, it involves the sovereignty of Europe, and it also involves the routes of the Arctic Circle that is melting. So part of the reason there's so much interest in Greenland is because there are new naval ways being possible now that the ice is melting, which brings access to new resources in the North Pole and routes, traffic. Jupiter, and no, Uranus is in Gemini, creating new routes, new pathways. And so Greenland is very strategic for this purpose. What more, that the eclipse in August, there are two eclipses that are happening as the nodes are moving into Leo Aquarius. The solar eclipse is at 20 degrees Leo on August 12th. The lunar eclipse is the last one in Virgo Pisces. So you see, because the nodes are at 29 degrees, an eclipse happens within 12 to 15 degree orb. So it could happen in the neighboring sign. So we're going to have another Virgo Pisces lunar eclipse that's going to affect employment, healthcare. And this eclipse in Leo is going to affect leaders and the whole uh, natality thing that growth rate and birth rate, among other things. But what is critical is that this eclipse on August 12th is going straight through Greenland and Spain. It stays mostly in the Arctic Circle, which is also interesting given that the Arctic Circle is now a political liability. Now, I will disclose that I have not seen conclusive evidence that the path of the eclipse means that these countries are more personally affected than other countries. It's not conclusive. So I would not say that just because the eclipse goes through Spain and Greenland, that everything's going to center around Spain and Greenland. But I'm still bringing it up because it's timely and it's an opportunity for us to research this further. So, um, when Greenland is going to be involved, it's going to trigger tension between the United States, Europe, and Russia. People were afraid of World War III because of Iran, but this is more contentious. This is more delicate. And depending on how Trump navigates this, how much he's willing to compromise, uh, it's gonna set a precedent, and it's risky. I'm gonna leave it to that. So, another thing about this chart, the Chiron return is going to be in 27, 28. And so, these are all sensitive times for that. So we're moving into this July configuration where Neptune is 4 degrees Aries and it's the midpoint between Uranus at 4 Gemini, Pluto at 4 Aquarius. So Neptune is kind of the driver of all this alignment because it sits at the center. It's also an Aries sign, which has to do with new and pioneering and transformative. So I've discussed some of these, let's look at the chart, extraordinary alignment between the slow moving planet. It never happens this way. Okay. This is rare to have them all line up at the same degree like that. Four of them. And then the faster one, like the moon and Venus, are going to sink into this configuration on different days. So you're going to have all kinds of very interesting formations as this is happening. Now, Jupiter is moving faster, and Jupiter, once it passes the opposition to Pluto, is not going to retrograde back. So it's speeding to the end of Leo. And so this summer is particularly critical because of the Jupiter factor. However, Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus are not going anywhere. They're going to stay in sync, moving kind of together for 2 years until June 2028. So one of the key concepts, Neptune in Aries, please watch this video on Neptune in Aries. It's very important and informative. There's also an article, if you prefer to read, on my website under article about it. So Neptune in Aries, Neptune always brings something that is fated, that is beyond our control, that that can dissolve. And Aries is the self. So why do we notice with Neptune in Aries is how people are erased, how people are disappeared. Whether we look for, women losing their identities and being told not to vote, it's a form of losing, erasing their voice. They're not able to make decisions about their pregnancy. Some of them are dying because dead fetuses cannot be aborted. You see that with the Palestinian cause and, you know, basically trying to delete a whole culture, land, and the ICE movement, where people are ending up in camps and we don't know where they're going. They're deported in foreign countries that they've never been to. So this Neptune in Aries brings the wound, the victimization related to agency, independence, sovereignty, the erasure of individuals, and the erasure of nations. But along with the wound, there's a higher spiritual intention. And this higher spiritual intention of Neptune in Aries is the accidental heroes. It's very chironic, actually, because Neptune in Aries is going to bring those you least expect to the forefront. Okay, so it's those accidental heroes because Neptune brings fate, and you suddenly can have a figure or a movement that comes out of, the woodworks and makes a statement and makes a difference. So the trade-off of the wound is empowerment, is the recognition of those who have been erased. But with Neptune in Aries, the more violence you use, the less you get. This is why Gandhi has Neptune in Aries, and he is one of the fathers of non-violent protest. So you get all of that in the video, Neptune in Aries, in the article. The other thing that's critical about Neptune in Aries is all energy supplies, batteries, grids. And we know that our grid is already uh, overtaxed. But now with AI data centers, so Neptune speaks about the energy supply, the power, and Pluto speaks about in Aquarius advanced technology, AI. So is AI going to find the resources so that we, Uranus in Gemini, can have information at the tip of our finger and ask AI all that we want and create this super intelligent artificial brain that will, supposedly make life easier for us. So, it all boils down to Neptune in Aries. Can we power this? Neptune is our dream. Aries is the power. Can you power your dreams? And the dream of AI is one of them. Now, how do you apply this to your own life? When you have Neptune in Aries in your chart, you are going to have creative inspiration. You're going to want to be an artist. You're going to want to be an astrologer. You're going to want to be an adventurer. You're going to want to do things because you have that sense of inspiration and agency. And you're going to want to upgrade your life. But the question is, can you power it? Do you have the means? Do you have the resources? Do you have the money? Do you have the land? Do you have the infrastructure? Do you have the willpower? So this Neptune in Aries can bring sometimes unexpected development where you find yourself in the least expected places. Let Neptune do the talking and follow. It's going to lead you to a place that maybe you did not anticipate. You had plans. Neptune has other plans. So, Uranus in Gemini, alliances are shifting. Bridges are burning and bridges are being built. Now, I want to plug in that those of you who are coming to the UAC conference in Chicago, September, I'm going to be talking about the Uranus return of the United States in Gemini. And I'm going to talk about more deeply about Chiron in Taurus. Um, and its greater implications, because here we're talking mostly with a square to Jupiter, but there's more to that. So Uranus in Gemini, siblings and neighbors, change of dynamics with siblings and neighbors. Are you building new alliances? Are you severing old alliances? Brothers and sisters, siblings. We see alliances in the Middle East shifting between Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, the brothers. They're kind of the siblings. They're cousins. And how everything is being reorganized because of the war in Iran. And suddenly, I talked about this in my previous video on Mars Uranus, how the Middle East is reorganizing because they felt so vulnerable under Iran's threat of closing the strait and bombing them from across the bay. Suddenly, these countries realize they have no defense. They have a lot of wealth, they have no defense. So that is going to create new dynamics. You can trust me. So shifting ideologies and mindsets. Think about, I know I've noticed in my own life that I've shifted some perspectives on things that I used to do and that I'm changing. You know, I changed the way I eat. So all kinds of new thoughts, new perspectives are filtering in, and it affects, it opens your mind. Ideally, you're gonna think more openly about things that you were overconfident about or you thought were, the only way. So I'm going to answer personal questions, and general question at the end of it. But I'm just wanting to unpack some of this um, magnificent, dramatic alignment of slower moving planets. So Pluto in Aquarius, the power and risk of advanced technology, the threat of tech fascism, tech surveillance, and mind control. Mind, Aquarius, control Pluto. So we know that there's a whole cabal of individuals who are, among them, Mr. Teal, who are orchestrating a whole takeover of civilization through technology, tracking everything we do, um, programming artificial intelligence to give us the answer that they want us to read, manipulating everything through technology and give the illusion of freedom. Now, if you look at Thiel's chart, he's a Jupiter in Leo. He's a Saturn in Aries. So he's having this simultaneous Saturn-Jupiter return. This is the transit of when he's meeting, when the agenda of his meeting was exposed. You can read about it. But looking ahead, that's a very strong Pluto in Aquarius threat. Even though he doesn't seemingly have planets in Aquarius, we don't know the time of birth to see where this lands. But, it takes us to this configuration, and I just want to bring your attention to the fact that I see a lot of reports about this, and people tend to be over optimistic about how this is going to be, blissful and the awakening of humanity. And, we've heard this before. Astrologers are holding on to hope and are trying, to sell this Barbeau basket as some kind of, sweet fruit basket. Jupiter Pluto is not easy. And all these trines and sextiles are not telling a story of everything's going to be resolved. They bring their own challenge. Now, doesn't mean it's going to be the other extreme. It doesn't have to be catastrophic. We are going to have breakthroughs. It is going to change mindset. It is going to bring a rotation of leadership, especially with Jupiter. That's going to, Jupiter in Leo represents kings. Pluto is the death of a leader. It's a rotation, whether it's a symbolic death or it's an actual um, leader being removed. There are going to be dramatic changes. And we are going to talk about the power grid issues and the AI center issues and the wildfire issues. So let's use astrology responsibly. And what I mean by that is be aware of the risks so that you can mitigate the risk and you can avoid worst case scenarios and bring awareness to the potential of what is really intended on a higher level. But never expect something to automatically bring you bliss because it doesn't work that way. So this video, if you want to look back on my channel, Pluto in Aquarius, it's, goes through the different stages and meanings. So when I look at the Jupiter-Pluto opposition, I want to go back to where it started. Whenever you see an aspect, you have to go to the initial conjunction. So as Jupiter opposes Pluto in July and August, when was the conjunction? When did it start? And the previous conjunction was during COVID, April 4th, 2020. Pluto and Jupiter were conjunct in Capricorn with Saturn and Pallas Athena. So Jupiter Pluto we talk about ideologies, we talk about beliefs, and we talk about Pluto, some kind of burst. It's not the first time that a Pluto-Jupiter-Saturn triple conjunction brought a disease. The first time in recent history was 1983 that they were all conjunct in Libra, and we had the AIDS epidemic. Second time, 2020, we have COVID, escaping from God knows where, we know where. But why is that related to diseases and epidemic? Because Pluto can relate to destructive agents, pathogens, and Jupiter can spread. And Saturn then brings all kinds of regulations and don't leave home and don't have sex and don't do that. But the other interesting thing is that during this conjunction, there was a breakdown of trust. Trust in the system, trust in the medical care, trust in the police with the George Floyd Black Lives Matter of 2020. So in Capricorn, it brought a lot of doubt into who is leading. Can we trust the leaders? And how are we going to navigate all this? So Jupiter has to do with faith. Pluto has to do with disillusionment, with loss of trust. So when we see this conjunction, there's usually some kind of bubble burst, disillusionment. They're lying to us, kind of thing. And so when we see here the opposition in July, will there be some kind of revelation, something that will create a loss of trust in the system? Aquarius in science, Aquarius in technology, Leo, how they're using that. The whole thing about cloning, the whole thing about uh, birth rates, will that lead to some kind of crisis in trust? The positive side of Jupiter Pluto, think of Jupiter as Sagittarius, Pluto as Scorpio. So when Sagittarius and Scorpio come together, it's powerful. People born with Pluto Jupiter are mighty because Jupiter will bring a positive spin to the Pluto crisis. So quite often, Pluto Jupiter as an intention is turn every crisis into an opportunity. It's about breakthroughs. It's about losing something, but gaining something much greater. Now, in our own lives, as Jupiter is in Leo, we ask ourselves, what do I want to do with my life? Where can I find meaning? And maybe there's going to be a call for leadership in your life. With Pluto in Aquarius opposing, you're going to ask yourself about, do I stay in my community or do I go solo? Jupiter in Leo goes solo, Pluto in Aquarius, your community. It's like John Lennon breaking the Beatles to release a solo album. That's kind of a Jupiter in Leo opposing Pluto in Aquarius. So you're going to want to separate from whatever holds you back from your higher calling and necessity. And there are going to be leaders in your life and children in your life that are going to be instrumental in your decision making. Now, I just want to fast forward and see where this configuration is going. So we talked about the fact that the three of them pretty much stay aligned together. But in November 27, which is a year and a half, the nodes are going to be on Pluto. So you're going to have the three of them with the nodal axis, and that's going to be another one of our meeting and presentations. In January 2028, Mars is going to join Pluto in these aspects. And in June 2028, Saturn is going to square Pluto. So you have Pluto 8, Neptune 8, Saturn 8, Mars, Uranus, Mars, Mercury, Uranus at 8 to 11. Now, the Uranus of the United States is 8 Gemini. Another thing I didn't include here is Chiron is at 8 Taurus as well. This is one of the most important chart of the decade. One of them is this summer with this Jupiter alignment. The next one is going to be mid 2028 because when Saturn squares Pluto, that's when the bill comes. That's when accountability comes. So right now, we are in a period of excess, of trillionaires, of spending, of more, more, more. When Saturn gets in Taurus, it's going to be time for the banks to be more conservative, to say we don't have cash anymore. You can't borrow more money. It's going to create a contraction. On an economic level, it's a market shrinkage. On a political level, it's again a fall down of leaders. On a spiritual level, it's karmic payback. That's when the time for those who abused power, at least some of them, may have to pay the consequences. So with this configuration, we have the nodes moving in Leo Aquarius. July 26, everything starts in July for 18 months, 19 months until 2028. And we talked about the eclipses coming. So I'm going to do a special on the nodes separately. So I won't spend, a lot of time here because there's more to cover. But pay attention to wherever the nodes are, you have to look at the rulers because the rulers are going to give you all the information of how the nodes are navigating. So wherever Uranus is, wherever the sun is, and every time the sun and Uranus come together in the space of these year and a half to 2 years, you're going to have meaningful realizations, meaningful activations. Just a quick look before we move forward at this guy. Putin, we talked about Zelensky having a Chiron return and Jupiter on his moon. He's having Saturn on his opposing his sun for the whole year. And in September, Mars is going to line up to his sun Saturn. So Putin is weakened. He's running out of resources. He's running out of manpower. This war is wearing him down slowly and surely in a very Saturn-Neptune manner. Now, I've explored how Saturn-Neptune cycles have frequently caused massive changes in the Soviet Union and in the Russian entity. He's born with Saturn-Neptune. Russia, modern Russia was created under a Saturn-Neptune, and now we are just in the aftermath of a Saturn-Neptune, and it hits his sun. Next year, Saturn is going to oppose Neptune. I told you the most difficult transit for any leader is a Saturn-Neptune opposition, especially if you're born with a conjunction. So things are not boding well for him. He's a master survivor and he's investing a lot of money to live 1,000 years. He's looking into genetic modification and elixirs and embryonic research to eternalize himself. But Saturn will be the test. So adversities, feeling that he's not getting what he wants, and that is eroding his leadership. To what extent, it's hard to know. But he's in a tight spot. And pay attention to this date because there could be retaliations. There could be affronts. And later the year, Jupiter on his Pluto is going to bring another cycle of that. So I want to jump to November. And the next Jupiter step. So we talked about Jupiter Chiron square, Jupiter Pluto opposition. The next one is Jupiter Mars south node. And look at this particular day, November 17. The sun is 25, the moon is 25, Jupiter is 25, everything's 25. So the next critical degree is going to be 25 fixed around November, which is the midterm of the United States election. Very critical because the late fixed degrees are where all these politicians are lined up. Mars of Netanyahu, Mars of bin Salman, Mars of Trump, and then some. And Putin, Pluto, and Zelensky's Saturn. So this is how it looks on Trump's chart. He's having a Mars return with Jupiter and the South Node. He's having a Jupiter opposition, excuse me, a Jupiter conjunction. It's a mistake here on his Pluto on middle of August. So, what does that mean? When you have strong aspect to the nodes, the energy of the planet on the nodes, whether south or north, is exacerbated. I call it, you've heard me say, it's on steroids. So you have Mars, which is aggressive, and it's willful, and it's creative, and you have Jupiter in Leo. We've talked at great length about that. They're all on the nodes on his Mars. So you have here a huge risk for self-aggrandizement, for aggressive ego trip, and for a feeling of threat. He feels threatened, and the reactions are going to be Jupiterian, dramatic. So this all lines up on his angles because 25 is his MC, right? And soon after, Jupiter is going to retrograde. So he doesn't cross his ascendant, but it will in 27. There's a health risk because all these Leonian energy can overburden the cardiovascular system. So risk of strokes, risk of heart attacks is considerable. But at the same time, on a geopolitical level, there's some kind of religious Jupiter, war, Mars. There is a justification, Jupiter, for doing something aggressive, Mars. This is not just affecting Trump, it's affecting all of us because we're all going to have this. Kids who are born with this are going to be incredible because it shows so much capacity and power, but it also shows excess and megalomania. So whether you're going to be a fabulous artist and a colorful leader, or whether you're going to become a dictator who's going to wage wars, it's going to be a room for everyone. Other candidates, Jupiter in Leo, Maria Machado, who was the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize and is on hold for whatever's going to happen with Venezuela, she may have a break here. Something may happen in her leadership that can boost reciprocity. She's already having her Saturn return. All these folks are born a few days from one another. Maria Machado, Gavin Newsom is born with the late Jupiter in Leo. And he's also having a Saturn return. So he's probably going to run for elections after the midterm, and he's probably going to announce it between November and the spring of 2027. Um, and then we talked about Peter Thiel and his, you know, dark agenda having that. So how far does this go? You know, what can we anticipate? We're going to unpack more of that. But I want you to pay attention to this energy, which is extremely flamboyant and flammable. And it provides this combination of fire, Mars, fire, Jupiter, fire, Leo, to such an extent that it can create extraordinary breakthroughs, but also unhinged behaviors. And like we say, justifications for aggressive behavior. So let's see how all these themes line up. And if you have planets around, late fixed signs, just do it. It's an energy that is very encouraging for taking risks, for breaking away from. Now, the important thing to remember is that Mars will turn retrograde in 2020. In 2027. So this Mars will go into early Virgo and then it's going to retrograde back to Jupiter. So we basically have a Mars Jupiter for about 6 months from late October into May 2027. The last thing I want to bring to your attention is the Venus cycle. With all the Taurus and the Leo and the Leo and the Taurus and the fixed signs, Venus is doing its own dance. Venus is going to square Mars twice. The first time in Gemini Virgo in July again. The second time in Leo Scorpio with Pluto nearby. So that's October 10. So early October, both Mars and Venus are approaching, the early degrees of fixed signs, and they are in turn lining up with Pluto and then squaring each other. So we talked about relationship changes, alliances changing, and economic shifts. Revelations about how we use our money and where to invest and what is gaining value, what is losing value. So probably a lot of fluctuation in the stock market. On a personal level, it can bring relationship breakups. So interestingly, in July, the square happens at the same time of the full moon with Jupiter. So there's a dramatic full moon with Sun, Jupiter opposing Moon, Pluto, Juno. So mark this date, July 29. Um, yeah. Then on October 23rd, Venus retrogrades to the star point. So most of you who are familiar with my work have heard me analyze the Venus-Sun conjunction. So Venus creates this pattern in the sky of a five-pointed star each time it conjuncts the Sun at an interval of 18 months. So it creates this five-pointed star as retrograde conjunction and then direct conjunction. So this coming one is critical. It's retrograde and it squares Pluto. This is the last one that's going to be in Scorpio. Okay. Um, Before it moves into a century of meetings in Libra. So Venus Sun relate to resources, relate to females in the zeitgeist, female leaders. So it's right ahead of the elections in the United States, the midterm election, and we could see women gaining power. Election in Israel, possibly October 27. Um, and again, looking at uses of power. Now, one last thing I wanted to add here. Soon after, the moon is going to be in Taurus and you're going to have a full moon on October 25. So Taurus, Scorpio, square Pluto, two Scorpio, full moon, square Pluto. Now we're going to revisit all these alignments as we get closer to the dates. But on a personal level, this Venus cycle will redefine relationships and financial incentives, financial value of things. I don't think it's a major crisis. It can actually be a time where you can make profits. I suspect that the greater financial crisis will take place when Saturn moves into Taurus with Chiron. But these are the pre-shocks that give us hints about where is the economy going. This is the chart of a lady called Darializa Chevalier. And she was elected a week ago in New York as the Democratic representative for um, the Congress, District, what was it? District 13 in New York. And so she's a Gen Z, born with the Uranus Neptune conjunction. But not only that, she's a Mars Sun in Sag. So people with Mars Sun in Sag are very vocal, very assertive, and they are very self-righteous. There can be a feeling of I'm right, I know, and I'm gonna tell it to you like it is, for better and worse. So it's interesting that her Jupiter is for Scorpio, aligned with the Jupiter Chiron coming up. So as we've seen with Trump and his administration pushing towards the extreme right of um, deregulation, privatization, laying off people, and the whole economic model of you know, everything for profit, drilling everywhere and deregulating so that all corporations have cheaper maintenance is backfiring. We see that with disease prevention, we see that with healthcare, we see that with job losses and whatnot. And so you have now the festering opposition who is frustrated and waiting in the sideline for their turn and are now, finding an opportunity to find their voice. And there is, for the first time in I think, a long, long time, the term social democracy is becoming more recognized in the United States. And some people are, sounding the alarm that the communists are invading. Some people are seeing that that can be a remedy for better, social security net and protecting the environment. But you will have a wave of extremes because that's always how life works. It's not just the transit, it's life. When the pendulum swings to the extreme right, it will swing back to the extreme left. It's science. And you are going to have stronger voice that are going to amplify the Communist Manifesto. Some of it will be scary. Some of it will be unhinged. And you're going to have all kinds of self-righteous agendas on both sides of the political spectrum. Whether it's, social justice, whether it's, privatization versus collectivization. We are in very, very interesting times as Chiron in Taurus is bringing a lot of awareness about economic injustice and the extreme wealth of some with the erasure of others. You have anger festering and leading to these young voices rising. Now, keep in mind that this generation with Uranus Neptune is the first conjunction of Uranus Neptune since the birth of Karl Marx. So Karl Marx was born with the previous cycle of Uranus Neptune. And I do believe on the longer term that the United States is moving towards a more social system because of this conjunction. How, to what extent, I don't think it's going to be extreme, but who knows? But it's not, it's something again to assimilate. Watch. These are again suggested videos. Saturn in Aries, Neptune in Aries. The Saturn-Neptune cycle, even though it's not exact any longer, is still very active. And those of you who missed this video, it's essential. It's very, very important because it gives us a hint about what's happening. and why the world looks like it does today. I'm going to end this with a prayer for humanity, for all of us individually. May the values of empathy, of justice, of integrity prevail, so that we may find balance and use these extraordinary transits for creativity and growth, because there's so much beauty. There is so much goodness in this world. There's so much we can do to make this world a better place. And it sounds cliche and quirky, but with these alignments in fire and air, there is no limit to how much good we can bring, to how many remedies and inventions and breakthroughs. But at the core of it, care and empathy are the guiding principles. Because without that, it's just noise. It's just children playing with big toys. It's not responsible. So we pray for Saturn to bring balance and integrity. We pray for Neptune to bring spiritual wisdom. We pray for Pluto to transform crisis into opportunity. And we pray for Uranus to open our minds to what really works and to build stronger communities. Amen. And may astrology guide us through. Blessings to all of you. And we'll meet again.